Welcome back to Deck Building with Bahumaut. Today we're going to look at lifesteal effects. Now, one of the most effective ways of doing this is there's several cards that allow you to damage your opponent as well as gaining life in the same attack or drain effect. We'll just boot up and now, the majority of these can be found in either the white or black colors. So, let's have a little look through and see what we can work with. Now, immediately, one thing that springs to mind is Kalastria Healer. Now, even though it's a 1/2 creature, if you revolve this lifesteal deck around the allies, so as in the majority of your creatures are allies, you'll passively be draining your opponent constantly. So even though the strength of the creature isn't that impressive, that's also a benefit because it means it's often not targeted because of its weak power and defense. So generally it's overlooked as it constantly affects your opponent. So definitely put in 4 of those to get us started. Another one that works particularly well with this as a defender is Vampire Envoy. Yet again, it's another ally, and it's a good blocker, and if you're attacking with it or tapping it in combination with other ally effects, you're gaining that passive life bonus as well, which can be used to trigger some other nasty effects all in one go. So you want at least 2 of those minimum, but it's a very nice blocker for very little amount of mana. Now we'll have a quick jump back to the white deck, and I'll show you a card that will work particularly well with Vampire Envoy. Now here we have Ondu War Cleric. The cohort ability allows you to passively, by tapping, gain 2 life. While that's a nice little bonus, tapping your Vampire Envoy at the same time, or using that cohort ability to tap Vampire Envoy, will give you a total of 3 life, and also count as 2 heal effects for creatures that, or abilities that gain benefits from that. So essentially, you can use it to power up other effects, such as Serene Steward. So every time you gain life, you can pay 1 white mana and buff up one of your other creatures, or Serene Steward. So having a couple of those in there will combine extremely well with the War Cleric. Kytheon is always a nice addition, just because of his ability to become indestructible. So combining him with other lifesteal effects will definitely help you, just because they can't destroy him easily. Now, because we're constructing a mostly ally deck, you definitely want cards in there that take advantage of rally effects. Now, especially since this is going to be a lifesteal deck, any effects that gain you bonus HP that also power up other abilities will be of exceptional use to you. So, put all of the Lantern Scouts in there, and another one that works with it is the 5-cost ally Hero of Goma Fada. Now, while expensive at 5 mana, the ability to make all of your creatures indestructible whenever an ally is played is not to be overlooked. Now this is one of the things that I was talking about before, which was triggering multiple life gain effects at once. Every time a separate effect triggers, something like this could be powered up. So Bloodbond Vampire is also an ally, has a relatively inexpensive cost, but can ramp up amazingly quickly with a deck like this. So definitely a couple of those will become your high-end creature. Now, we want to move on to our mixed types. So, let's have a look at some of the nasty combination types that are in this little selection here. Now, one that works ridiculously well is Cliffhaven Vampire. See, every time a gain life effect is triggered, your opponent loses 1 life. And if each one of those effects is separate, that's triggered multiple times. So, for example, every time each one of these is triggered, so you have 4 in your deck, every time each one of those is triggered individually, that's also another additional damage that one of these will deal. But consider the scenario when you're attacking with an invulnerable army of lifelink creatures. Every one of those creatures will count as an individual life gain source, which means that you can deal massive amounts of damage as a result of having even one of these cards out. Plus also, he's a quite handy blocker, and also fleshes out your flying defense. Another one that works well is Drana's Emissary. Now, it's not particularly defensive, but the constant drain effects work quite well, and even if you lose it, you're only paying 3 mana for a cheap flyer, so it's not a big loss, and can be replaced by the more powerful Cliffhaven Vampire when you draw it. But at least a couple can go in there without any real negative repercussions. Now, for those people who have actually unlocked nearly all the cards, you might have Sorin, Grim Nemesis. While he probably won't get to him in most games, especially not in high-level tournaments, because most of the time games are nearing their end by the time something like that could come into play. But for just general play, he's definitely quite a fun one, because even he comes into play with 6 counters, which automatically allows you to wipe out anything with power 6 or less, and every time you trigger his +1 ability, that's a chance to deal damage to your opponent. Now, the majority of creatures in this deck are going to be within the 2 to 4 range. So if every turn you have the potential to deal 2 to 4 damage just by triggering him. And of course with the lifesteal effects, if you do get him up to the 9 ability, you can have some ridiculous fun with the amount of tokens he can spawn. So definitely one to put in there for entertainment value, although you may want to remove him for high level play. Now, you don't really have that many removal spells since you're using ally effects as the equivalent of your spell casting. But it is worth putting in a couple of these because they allow you to exile a permanent. Now this can be a creature, enchantment, artifact, even a planeswalker in a single shot, which at the cost of 3 life in a lifesteal deck isn't really a big drawback. So you definitely want to put a couple of those in there. A nice cheap frontline fighter, even though she's not an ally, she can be the difference between an easy win and a hard fought battle. She only has 2 cost. The downside is of course the mixed mana cost, but the fact is you can pay 1 mana, and if a creature is the target of a spell and going to die anyway, you can sacrifice your own creatures in order to gain life from their toughness. And since this is a lifesteal deck, if you manage to get to 30 or more life in a single player duel, or 40 or more life in a 2-headed giant duel, then her second ability comes into play and you can trigger that at any time. Now, being able to trade a crappy creature for anything that's not a land on the field to destroy is quite a nice ability in my mind. And also, of course, she has Death Touch, which just is great. So, if you've got her, definitely chuck her in. Now, some of you might be wondering why we don't go with Bloodghost Knight. Well, I'm not intending to put any specific creature targeting enchantments in play. Although you definitely can if you want to make it a more power-up individual creatures deck. So keep that in mind if you want to tweak your setup. Now, we can also put in some planeswalkers as well, because coming into play and being able to instantly destroy a creature is a nice effect. But the main thing of interest to us is drawing a card at the cost of 1 life. Now, once again, lifesteal deck, 1 life isn't a big deal. Whereas in a normal deck, that constant chip of lost life can be a turn-off. So, but for us, it should work well, provided we've got enough support from our creatures. Now, another one we can use is Kalitas. Basically, think of him as a necromancer and able to revive any opponent's creatures that have been destroyed on your side of the field as 2/2 vampires. He also has lifelink and can sacrifice vampires or zombies, which a lot of this deck is, to power himself up. So, while you may not use him initially to be an offensive force, the ability to just passively generate zombie tokens by killing your opponent's creatures is definitely a nice thing to consider. And if you want to, you can then use those tokens to power him up and use his lifelink effect to continually harass the enemy. Especially when combined with Hero of Goma Fada, its indestructible effect. Now, at first glance, the Malakir Familiar doesn't really look like it gels well with this deck. But keep in mind the trigger effects of Ondu War Cleric and Vampire Envoy. And of course, Drana's Emissary. All of these, so at the start of every turn, you'll be gaining 1 life, which is 1 health effect. You can manually trigger this for another health effect, and you can target this for the tap from the Ondu War Cleric to gain an additional life effect. All 3 of those every turn if you want, if you manage to draw that setup. So every time you trigger or gain life effect, this creature gains +1/+1. And it also has Death Touch, which makes it particularly good as an aerial defender, because it doesn't matter the size of your opponent. Plus, you can also use Serene Steward to permanently power them up and make them bulky, massive Death Touch walls, which can be quite nasty. So, we want a couple of those to buff our flying defenses. And we can also use Liliana, because her lifelink ability is quite handy, but for endgame, being able to make your opponent discard cards, also returning creatures, and her final ability will just make a joke of the rest of the game, because any creature from that point on that you kill of an opponent or your own will come back into play on your side of the field. So essentially at that point the game is over. There is no way for your opponent to win unless they do direct damage. Also, we're going to chuck in the always useful, always watching. Now, relating to lands, one thing that works well with this deck is putting in at least a couple of Mortuary Mires, because having the ability to revive creatures, especially those with limited amounts, such as Hero of Goma Fada, the Necromancer, and Lantern Scout is quite useful most of the time. You can also take advantage of... if I can find it... Westvale Abbey with this deck. Because it's such a creature-heavy deck, you will get up to 5 creatures fairly quickly because of their low costs. But if you choose to do that, if you choose to sacrifice 5 of them, you can flip Westvale Abbey to create a 9/7 flying lifelink indestructible haste creature. Doing that as the opponent attacks with their best creature is definitely hilarious. And also, can flip the tables in your favor. And of course we'll add in our plains and swamps, although we can take 2 swamps out because we've put in a couple of mires. Now we still need the mixed land, which is there, Isolated Chapel, and we may want to consider putting in a couple of rogues passages to get our lifelink creatures past defenders. So what have we got? We're still 1 short, so I'll put in 1 more Mortuary Mire, which is always handy. Now, we're only 4 cards away from our total, so what do we need to add? Now we could potentially put in more removal spells, things like that, if you wanted to make it a sort of more rounded deck, I guess. But of course you could also put in more ally effects if you wanted to trigger those. But definitely consider Declaration in Stone. Being able to remove multiple creatures for a cost of 2 is ridiculously effective, and they go into exile, not just destroyed. So even if they have indestructible, anything, as long as it's not hexproof, will be destroyed by that. And I'll put in another couple of the low cost. Oh, that was what I forgot. I knew there was something. You can also use Kor Bladewhirl, another nice cheap opening creature, which adds first strike to all your creatures whenever an ally comes into play. Now, the high proportion of allies in this deck will allow you to be playing one nearly every turn with ease. So you're constantly triggering those ally effects, including lifesteal, gaining life, first strike, lifelink, and indestructible. And as well as triggering all your beneficial other effects. So, this is our lifelink deck, and we'll see how it weighs up against an opponent. So, you can see from there that our balance between the colours is fairly good. The majority of our creatures are quite cheap, so we shouldn't have any problem casting them, even though there's the occasional dual type in there. And although we don't have many spells or enchantments, as in sorceries instance or enchantments, our creatures are actually causing the spell effects. So that should compensate for that. So it looks like we're ready to go. Let's try it out. Now, good balance between speed and synergy. Control is a little high, so you could swap in some slightly more powerful creatures to even things out, which I did in Master Lifesteal deck to make sure everything is even. But this rough start should at least let us see how effective our ally combinations are. And see if we can get an actual decent hand this time. Or at least not have to wait 4 or 5 turns for our third mana. Okay, so let's see how and if we're ready to go. Once again, 2 mana isn't exactly ideal. Ah, there we go. Okay, so we have our 4 mana, as well as a cheap creature and an endgame, well, a mid-game creature. So that's more than enough to keep me happy and good enough to start with. And lucky for us, we managed to get our healer very early, which means our drain effect will be in demonstration very quickly. Now, it may not seem like much, but every turn, or at least almost every turn, having that continual drain just it works surprisingly quickly, especially if you've got a pair on the field. And because it's such a weak creature, it's often just not targeted, which is perfect for our needs. For example, if you have almost all your other creatures are more powerful than it and are more likely to be targeted. So, alright, well, even though we're dealing direct damage with it, its normal purpose is just to sit there and constantly drain. Now, we're going to need a few more creatures if we're going to flip Westvale Abbey, so hopefully we can get a little closer to that. Once again, we may have a one-sided battle on our hands from mana effects from our opponent. Ah, there we go. Okay, so it doesn't look like it's going to be completely one-sided. Right, Flare Drone can be quite nasty, so we won't have everything all our own way. But the good news for us is we've already got enough for Hero of Goma Fada, so we can just attack. And of course we're constantly draining every time. But the healer is even more effective when you're playing in Two-Headed Giant because it affects both opponents. So while you're only getting 1 life, you're dealing 2 damage with each ally you play. And therefore, in Two-Headed Giant, the life total is actually gone through quicker. Because in a single player game, you're only dealing 1 damage to 1 opponent. So you have to deal 20 in effect. Whereas in Two-Headed Giant, you're dealing 1 to each player, and the 30 life total only takes 15 turns to get through. So, another ally here, also doubling the effectiveness of our healer's damage. So you can see it affecting twice there. Plus we also have our invulnerability. And if I really wanted to, I could use Declaration in Stone to make things even more tough. Yeah, why not? Okay, so let's get our attack in and see how we go. Okay, not blocking. Alright. It's very ballsy strategy. Oh, that's right. The 3/4 can't block without another creature on the field on their side. So, looks like we're going to win because of their poor creature choices. So, another healer, and the game's over. So turn 5 or turn 6, drain effects probably took half of that life, and the other half was taken by just regular attacks. But because of the cheap cost of the creatures and the constant working of the synergy and of ally effects, it chews through your opponent's life extremely fast. So it works extremely well as dual decks in a two-headed giant, or even just as a support, because you might have a person playing with you who's a spell slinger or a large creatures deck, so you can act as support for pretty much any situation and be of use to that person, either buffing up your hit points to make yourselves a wall, or damaging your opponent while your ally builds up their creature defense and attack. So lifelink is definitely an interesting strategy to play, and I hope this has helped you see how it might be of use to you. Alright, I think that's it for today. And this is Deck Building with Bahumaut. Bahumaut signing off.